The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, communicating climate change to customers. My guest today is Melissa Baldwin. She is the new Senior Vice President at Tigercomm. Welcome to the show, Melissa.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here and have this conversation with you.
So excited to talk about climate change, and it's heady days. We're sitting here in September on the tail end of Hurricane Ida, which is still raining on the Northeast United States, but more importantly, gave a direct blow to Louisiana and New Orleans. And New Orleans is without power now for the last 4 days. And it is a brutal situation, not as dire, luckily, as Hurricane Katrina, but it's still a major catastrophe for Louisiana, and I do not want to minimize that whatsoever. But before we get into the heart of our show here, Melissa, give our listeners some background on yourself. How did you get interested in the environment and communications?
Sure. So thank you so much. So for me, this all really started back in 1999 when I was in college. I went to Bowling Green State University for 2 years. I was actually studying to be a computer animation artist, which turned out to not be my field. But while I was there, I happened to take an elective called Critical Thinking About Environmental Futures. And that really changed my life. Once I learned about climate change, I learned about the disinformation campaign. I learned about clean energy solutions. I knew from that moment that that's what I wanted to dedicate my career to. And I've been really fortunate that I've been able to really work in climate change now for about 17 years, working for various nonprofits. I started my career at an international PR agency, Hill & Knowlton, which was really great because I got my PR chops there. I learned the business. And then when I had an opportunity to go work full-time on climate, I did that. I went to work for Solar Alliance for Clean Energy. And since then, I have had about 10 years where I started my own communications firm, Chase Media Services, which was recently acquired by Tigercomm. And at Chase Media Services, I represented a variety of businesses, nonprofits, scientists, lawyers, youth, doctors, all working to educate people on climate change impacts. So I've had a varied career working for nonprofits, working for PR firms, and then owning my own business for 10 years. And now I'm really happy to be working with Mike and the team at Tigercomm.
Give us a little more background on your work with the Solar Alliance for Clean Energy. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So that is a nonprofit. It works in 5 states in the Southeast region. And when I started, it was 2006, and I was their Florida climate organizer. And it was actually really exciting. By 2008, it was the heydays of climate action in Florida. So we had Governor Charlie Crist, and I was a lobbyist in Tallahassee. I was there in 2008 when they passed HB 7135, which at the time was the most progressive clean energy policy in the Southeast. Since then, all of that has been stripped back. And so now Florida really is struggling in the policy arena. But the work I did was organizing businesses and voices to speak out in support of action, supporting clean energy. And it was actually there that I met would become my first customer at Chase Media, and that is Solar Source, which is a local residential and commercial solar contractor based in Pinellas County.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about the Southeast and sustainability. It's a very contrasting situation we have in the Southeast. We have the Carolinas that have embraced solar energy. Certainly the North and South Carolina are some of the best solar markets in the country. Then we have Florida, which has virtually no distributed generation market, unfortunately, but has lots of utility scale solar.
Yeah.
And that is your home state, right? Florida?
Yes, that's right. I live and work in Tampa, Florida, a suburb of Tampa, Florida, and I've been here since 2004.
Yeah. And I would venture to guess that Florida is one of the toughest states to work in for clean energy professionals.
Yeah, it's part
Why
of my
is that? Because it's the Sunshine State after all.
I like to say I've been working in Florida and lobbying the legislature long enough to know what it feels like to bang my head up against the wall. I don't know exactly why that is. I think that it's a missed opportunity for Florida. I'd like to think that it'll come around. The state has made recent progress in starting to even say the words climate change and sea level rise. We recently passed a resiliency bill, which is a step in the right direction. It looks at building seawalls and adapting to sea level rise, which is an existential threat for Florida, but it does nothing to address heat and it does nothing to reduce carbon pollution. And so it's a minor step in the right direction, but we can achieve more. There's a really big growing group of advocates, nonprofits, businesses who are advocating for policy in Florida, but we're missing out on some really important policies. We have no third-party power purchase agreements are allowed. We have one of the worst energy efficiency policies in the country. It's the 6th worst in the country. And so we really just have a lot of opportunity for growth. And I personally am a fan of policy as a way to create change. But one of the things that I'm excited about in working for Tigercomm is that what we can do with businesses is that businesses can go ahead and create this change as industries. And so that's a pivot that I'm really excited about as we move into pushing forward the clean energy revolution and using that business voice to create that change through market demand and market and taking over these markets.
Let's talk about your work going forward and with Tigercomm. What is the opportunity in your mind that, forced your hand, so to speak? I mean, this is a great move. I think it puts you on a national stage, certainly. And Mike Casey and company at Tigercomm are, of course, very well known in our industry as the premier marketing communications firm for clean tech. Tell us about the move and what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, I was really excited to be able to speak with Mike, and you're right, they're one of the top clean tech PR firms, and we like to help customers win with businesses, investors, and policymakers. And for me, when I talked to Mike, one of the first conversations I had with him, something I took away immediately, and when we were having these conversations about the acquisition, I was actually talking to some other firms as well. But in my first conversation with him, I learned things. And I thought, this guy, he really gives good advice. And I think that that's one of the things that our customers look to Tigercomm for, is that we really can provide that counsel, that insight, given our background, combination of public affairs, politics, NGOs, and business. And so that was one of the things that initially that really got me interested in learning more about Tigercomm and thinking about joining the team there. And as I continued to work with Mike, the other point that he made to me that I think is really compelling is just what we were talking about before, and that is that there is certainly a role for NGOs to play and nonprofits to play, and that's important in advocating for policies. But there's also a really important opportunity and a role for businesses to play in advancing the clean energy economy. And so being on top of that, being in this clean energy space right now when it's just poised for growth, it's poised to take off, was really an opportunity that I just couldn't refuse. I couldn't turn it down.
Very good. Let's talk about communicating climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I will admit, it is a touchy subject sometimes. It can be a difficult subject to communicate in a positive manner because the way it manifests is negatives like storms that cause blackouts, like we have currently in New Orleans, that we had in Texas, that we've had in California with rolling blackouts due to fires. So many problems, so to speak, and those problems are only going to get worse. We all know this now.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the fundamentals and how do you approach communicating climate change?
Well, I think one of the keys in successful communication is really understanding your target audience and meeting them where they're at. So knowing who you're speaking to, knowing their values, knowing what's important to them, that's going to help you communicate effectively and really craft a message that's going to connect and hit home for them. And so for some people, that message is climate change. There's a huge amount of people who are concerned. In fact, the polls from the Yale Climate Change Opinion Map show that the majority of Americans know that climate change is happening. The majority of Americans know that it's caused by humankind. But the disconnect is that the majority of Americans also do not think it'll affect them personally. So I spent many years, over 15 years of my career, really trying to help people understand, how does climate change affect you personally? And we did that in talking about how climate affects your health. We did that in talking about how climate affects storms, how climate affects sea level rise. But as you said, that problem message can be a tough message to work with, and given that it's such a negative. And so the other piece of my career that is that's a narrative that really has flowed throughout my career is that we talk about problems and solutions. So you always want to pivot whenever you introduce a problem, you want to offer a solution. And so, that's why it's so exciting to be working with Tigercomm and some of our new clients who are offering real meaningful solutions to the climate crisis. So let me just circle back to your question there and make sure I answered it. Do you repeat it again? Because I want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah, it was simply how do you approach communicating climate change? And I resonated with your first response, which is understand your customer, understand who your target audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were talking in the pre-show, like, I never lead with sustainability when I walk in to a meeting with executives of a facility, facility owners. We're here to talk about rooftop solar, for example. I'm always focusing on the financial benefits initially, and then feeling them out and determining if sustainability, for example, which leads us to potentially the conversation about climate change and resiliency. But I'm curious, how do you, when you say understand your customer, let's give some examples of potential customers for Tigercomm or
Mm-hmm.
Tigercomm's customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the leading manufacturers and clean energy organizations like SEIA and Trina Solar and Vestas and
Mm-hmm.
OEA and Apex Clean Energy. These are just the obvious ones on Tigercomm's website. So, but yes, that's the question. How do you figure out how to go at it? And then how does that evolve, I guess, over you're working with customers for extended periods of time, and does the messaging evolve as the relationship
changes? Oh, it does. Absolutely. That's a great question. Well, let me start with a point that I think is helpful to all of us now. And this is something that's relatively new, and that is that renewable energy is now cheaper than every form of fossil fuels. And so finally, we have this cost argument really strongly behind us. The market is poised to expand. It's an opportunity to create jobs. And so the jobs discussion, I think, is a really important one to have. Your point about how does the narrative change, I want to tell you about one of the clients that I'm working with, the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance. So I know that you already had an interview with Michael Parr, and he talked about this concept, and so you're familiar with it. But I think this is really interesting work as we look at, solar and how it's manufactured, and we start to think about scope 3 emissions and embodied carbon. How can we manufacture solar in a better way that is more sustainable and more responsible? And we think about one of the goals of the Alliance is to educate the marketplace that all solar is good, but some solar is better. And so as we have been working to get that message out there and educate the marketplace about that, one of the things that we've found is now there's this growing awareness of embodied carbon. There is concern from buyers, and even there's analysis from the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And they did an analysis that looks at that it suggests that by 2040, solar manufacturing emissions will rival those of the global aluminum industry. Absent any change in solar manufacturing practices, we will see 14 to 18 gigatons of carbon pollution from coal-fired solar. So we have just what you said, Tim, earlier, and does the message change? Yes, it does. As you educate and as you enhance awareness and as concepts start to cement and become normalized and institutionalized, that's when you can pivot more to talking about solutions. And so fortunately, with the issue of coal-fired solar, there's an exciting new solution that's going to be rolled out. It's going to be rolled out by the Global Electronics Council, and it's the EPEAT ranking. And that looks at electronic products' environmental impact, but now they're looking at working to identify, looking at solar panels and identifying low embodied carbon in solar. So does that answer your question in terms of how do messages change? How do they evolve over time?
Yeah, there is a certain percentage of the population at large, as you mentioned, that doesn't buy into climate change or human caused climate change.
Yeah.
And yet the drumbeat of very credible scientific information only gets louder and louder. We just had the release of the new IPCC report, which, basically says, yo, humanity, you're really asleep at the wheel here. And you need to vastly reduce your emissions in the next 8 years, not 30 years, 8 years.
Yes.
If you're going to avoid runaway climate change. And so it's a bit of a conundrum to me.
Yeah.
And, but let's talk about clean tech manufacturers, for example. I mean, if their consumer, so to speak, solar developers, solar financiers, solar EPCs, there is a clear collaboration there that we are on a mission for the energy transition.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just no doubt that you can, lean on that, so to speak. When you think about the low carbon solar alliance, the ultra low carbon solar alliance,
mm-hmm.
that is a great case in point where, the industry has an opportunity to reduce its carbon footprint. We're in denial that there is a lot of coal-fired solar panels, and the footprint of those is, more than 2x more carbon coming out of a high carbon solar panel. And that's just not acceptable, right? When we have the technology to produce lower carbon solar panels.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious though, when you think about industry to industry manufacturing into clean tech consumption, I guess, do you even have to lean on climate change, or
no?
What is your thoughts about that?
I think it depends on the audience. It depends on who you're talking to and what is their pain point, what are their values, what matters to them, what's the WIFM, what's in it for them, right? And so how can you take your solution and communicate it in a way, in a language that resonates with your target audience? And just to talk a little bit more about your point about, there are still a lot of folks who deny man-made climate change. You see it all over the place. And we do ourselves no favors. There are certain people who are just not going to change their mind, right? But maybe we can build a bridge to them in our communication when we're talking about job creation, we're talking about economic development, we're talking about resilience in the face of future storms. So I think one of our clients, Next Tracker, is a really great example of that. They work all over the world, all over the country. They deal with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. And for many of them, it's about jobs. It's about job creation. And it's about resilience. And one other point that I wanted to make that we talked about earlier, and I think this is a good example too of how clean technology is innovating, is that Next Tracker has been working really hard to develop solar panels that are resistant to extreme winds. And so I think there's another conversation to be had about how clean energy, distributed energy, different sources of clean energy technologies can help us to be resilient as we adapt in a warming world. And I've also seen it that some people who don't acknowledge man-made climate change, they do acknowledge the problems. Like, for example, in Florida, they're talking about sea level rise. They're talking about resilience. So we're talking about storms in the Midwest. We're talking about flooding. So what are the technologies that we have to be resilient to that? How can we innovate in a resilient way through distributed clean energy technology that's not relying on old fossil fuels?
That is certainly a theme that I see manufacturers in the storage industry, for example, leaning into.
Yeah.
And, many consumers still don't realize that if they have a solar array on their roof, but no battery in their garage, then they can't benefit from the solar energy when the grid goes down. Unfortunately, you need to be able to microgrid. And of course, we're huge into solar and storage here at Continental. It has a very bright future. I like to say, today maybe 0.5% of people have a battery. In 10 years, almost everybody's going to have a battery, because it truly provides a level of resiliency that you just cannot have without it.
Mhm.
And it could be standalone as well. You don't need a solar array, right? You can charge the battery with the grid, but
Mhm.
it's nice to have when the grid isn't there.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of battery, we have another client, a very exciting client called Soluna. Are you familiar with Soluna and John Belizaire? Have you heard of them?
No, I'm not familiar.
This is very cool. Okay, so they are addressing two huge challenges that we have globally right now. So the first challenge is computing needs in data centers. So globally, data centers use a lot of electricity. They're high intensity users. By 2030, we project that 20% of global electricity needs will be for data centers, for computing. And also when you think about Bitcoin mining, that's only going to go up. So the other huge challenge that we have is curtailment in renewable energy. So at any given time, we see that when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining, it's not perfectly aligned with demand. And so we have these situations where renewable energy farms have to curtail their energy. It's called a lot of things. It's called wasted energy or spilled energy. But the projections that we see is that it's the equivalent of about 132 million barrels of oil, or 14% of all solar generation in the globe is wasted or curtailed. So we have these two huge challenges, and our client, John Belizaire, has come up with a solution. It's a really elegant solution that addresses both of them. So what he does is he brings modular, batchable data centers to renewable energy farms, and he puts them on site. So they're there to demand energy when it is being otherwise curtailed. So he can prevent renewable energy farms, solar farms, wind farms from having to waste any energy. His motto is sell every megawatt. And so this is a really exciting solution. And what he talks about is that computing is a better battery. So I think it's a really cool concept. I'm very excited about the work that he's doing and his ability to solve these two huge problems with one elegant solution.
And spell the name of that company if you would.
It's Soluna.
Soluna.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And are they, well, yeah, explain that business model a little more if you would.
So it's vertically integrated batchable computing centers that can be deployed on site at renewable energy plants. So for example, their flagship project is at a wind farm in Morocco. And so this is a giant wind farm that actually wasn't able to really easily connect to the grid. So that's really one of the cool parts of the story, is that the reason he solved this problem is that he solved it for himself. So he was managing this wind farm in, I always mispronounce the name. I want to try and say it correctly. Harmattan, in Africa, near Morocco. And he was trying to figure out, how am I going to address this issue with all of this energy I'm producing? It's not easy to get it on the grid. What am I going to do with it? And he came up with the solution of vertically integrated batchable computing centers. So he puts the computing data center on site at the wind farm. And so it is able to consume the electricity. And then that's really good too, because I know there's another, just like there's concern about coal-fired solar, there's also growing concern and alarm around how much energy Bitcoin uses, cryptocurrency and climate change. That's another narrative that we see evolving, and there's concerns around that. So he was able to solve that problem for himself. And in doing so, he realized that this is a scalable solution worldwide. So he can deploy these batchable computing centers on site at renewable energy farms, for example, wind farms or solar farms that know they have a problem with curtailment. And the beauty of this in the batchable data centers too is that for a lot of things like Bitcoin mining or even AI and other research-based computing, is that you can turn it on and turn it off. It's something that's a long-term demand. And so you can turn on the system when there's excess energy to be used, and then turn it off when there's not. So that's another beauty of the solution.
Very cool. I look forward to learning more about that. Their website is solunacomputing.com. So check that out. So communicating climate change to customers, we have human health front and center on the table, and we have resiliency or hardening of the built environment, because the climate is changing and we have to adapt. And then we have to decarbonize in order to hopefully come back from the brink of complete climate chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all wonderful things for society. I would argue that they are worth an infinite amount of money. There is no ROI that you can measure, right? These are existential threats that we are facing.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't others, and that may be more time sensitive. The AI explosion is one that I talk about on this show and my other show, The Clean Power Hour.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know what that is, just Google it. And it is a dangerous phenomenon as we get better at inventing AI that's smarter than humans potentially. But let's try to wrap this up with a bow, I guess, around climate change. And when you're talking with your customers and understanding their customers, so to speak, one of the challenges that I see is that we are trying to think 100 years into the future, basically, right? And plan for a better, safer, healthier future today. And that can be very abstract. And so I'm just curious, how do you approach that and perhaps influence your customer to more effectively reach their customer on these issues?
Well, I'll just add one point to what you said that made me think about. I've thought about this before and how we're short-term thinkers, but really it's not impossible for us to think in long-term in terms of centuries and not just in terms of 5 years or decades. If you look at even Notre Dame, it took hundreds of years to build. So humans are capable of thinking beyond themselves, of thinking of future generations and building beautiful things that have a legacy that lasts a lifetime. But to your question about how do we help our customers communicate their point of difference to their customers, I think it really comes down to, as I said before, knowing your target audience, knowing what speaks to them. And the other theme that I see in a lot of my clients and also in my previous work is this concept of co-benefits. When I worked with doctors, we talked about, when you talk about energy policy, you talk about the co-benefits. So when you reduce pollution, you also reduce deaths related to air pollution, and it's good for the climate, it's good for our health. So talking about and identifying the co-benefits, I think in the case of most of our customers, it's jobs, it's opportunity, it's economic development. It is clean air and clean water, because that is a real benefit that does affect our health, that does affect our well-being. And so I think it's identifying those co-benefits and those win-win situations that can help you communicate to your target audience and to your customer in a way that is meaningful to them, that connects with them, that hits their pain point, or that hits, that speaks to their mission and their values.
You hit the nail on the head here. And I like to say that this is the $100 trillion opportunity. Even though it is a big investment that we need to make in the energy transition, by some estimates, the United States could easily invest $1 trillion a year for the next 20 years to clean the grid and electrify everything and step back from our heavy, heavy use of fossil fuels, right? And that sounds like a massive investment. But the ROI, by many estimates, is going to be 3x at least. And so that does mean jobs. It does mean profits for companies and for individuals. Jigar Shah likes to use the frame, this is a wealth creation event and a wealth transfer, right? Infrastructure is a wonderful thing when it is robust. And that is the delta between now in New Orleans and Katrina 16 years ago. The disaster is not nearly what it was 16 years ago, not because the storm was smaller, the storm was actually bigger, but because we have made a multi-billion-dollar investment in infrastructure in New Orleans that has now prevented many neighborhoods from being underwater. It's one thing to be without power. It's another to be completely underwater, right?
Yeah.
And having to sit on your roof and bake like a hamburger. So it is a very different situation. But if I'm going to invest in the energy transition, if I'm a business owner or if I'm a manufacturer, and I'm going to really focus on the energy transition, so to speak, do I have to embrace that, that we are in a crisis, or can I just quietly go about my business knowing that I'm doing good in the world?
I don't think it's required. I think that's a great question. I think that I hate to use something that's such a common phrase, but I think it's different strokes for different folks. I think certain people will do this because it's good for business and it's an opportunity. And I think that's perfectly fine. And it just so happens that you're also making the world a better place for your children and my children. So it's a wonderful win-win. But you said something earlier that I wanted to just ping off of in your point about what just happened in New Orleans. It happened before, but this time it was better. The World Meteorological Organization just put out a report, and they found that weather-related disasters are increasing over the last 50 years. They're causing way more damage, but the silver lining is that they're causing fewer deaths. So the lesson there is that we can adapt, we can innovate, and we can find ways to survive and thrive in this new world. But we'll all be better off if we get to the root cause of the problem and really address the heat trapping pollution that is driving this problem. So I think for many people that is a driver, but for other people, the jobs and a wealth creation, I think is a perfectly reasonable and fine talking point to incorporate when you're trying to move people and move markets.
Very good. Well, let's spend our last few minutes together talking about Tigercomm. And if I'm a clean tech company, whether I'm a manufacturer or an association or an EPC, and I'm casting about for support on the marketing communications front, why should I consider Tigercomm? And what is it what is the difference that Tigercomm brings compared to the alternatives?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, we are mission driven. And so we are really, truly focused on these issues. We're focused on the clean technology economy. We have this long history of working in this space and also in developing thought leadership and really understanding the industry, which is a relatively new industry and is still growing. So I think it's thought leadership. I think it's a dedicated mission that is aligned with the industry. And I think also just that our team is a group of people who really genuinely care about these issues. We understand these issues, and we're really dedicated and motivated to helping our clients succeed, to helping them win with government and to win with clients. And I think the other thing too is really the thought leadership that we're able to provide in terms of having this long history in the industry, seeing where it's headed, and also not being afraid to tell our clients when we don't agree with their idea, we've seen otherwise. So that's another important thing that you do as a public relations strategist is really provide that counsel and upward management, as my boss likes to say. So yep. I think sometimes a business has a certain idea, and we're another group of folks that can come in and use our experience, use our years of working in this industry and the relationships that we have with reporters and others in the industry and understanding of it to really shape and grow that in a meaningful way. And right now, the other point that we are really seeing, one trend that we're seeing, and this has been happening for a long time, is that as we move away from traditional PR, earned media, newspaper, radio, print, and we move into this new digital world where people are consuming their media on social media, they're consuming media on their phone, they're not reading newspapers. We see this trend where you produce your own content, we call it owned content, where just like you're producing this podcast and others produce their own content. And you can take that content and put it out there and repurpose it. And so we have a lot of what we're seeing is that it's that second hit. So you generate the media hit, but then it gets shared on social media or it gets talked about on LinkedIn. And it's that the eyeballs are seeing the content not in the original location on the traditional earned media, but rather through social media or other shared channels. So that's an exciting space because it actually gives you a lot more creative control. As you produce your own content, you're able to say what you want to say exactly how you want to say it.
Agreed, agreed. And that is something I'm very, excited about and fond of here at the Solar Podcast. It's to be part of the podcasting movement, so to speak, which is really now just completely exploding, is really wild and really intense. And I'm just glad that I got on the train when I did back in 2017. And here we are riding a massive wave. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Melissa, for coming on the show. I do need to make a couple of quick announcements, and I'm going to put my landing page on the screen. If you appreciate this content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that on YouTube. If you just search for Tim Montague on YouTube, you'll find the channel, or go to cesenergy.com/podcast. Hit that big red subscribe button. We're bringing you weekly interviews with folks like Anson Moran, who is spreading the good word about Solar App Plus, a tool to speed solar permitting for residential solar. We're talking with folks like Bree Bruce, who is a thought leader in wildlife and solar at RP Construction Services. And we bring you discussions with Becca Jones Albertus, who you would never get to talk to otherwise, or even have any exposure to, because she's the head of the Solar Energy Technologies office at the DOE. Some amazing personalities and stories that we're bringing you week in and week out, and then bringing you a weekly rundown of the energy transition news with my colleague, John Weaver, who is a journalist for PV Magazine with the Clean Power Hour. So check that out at cesenergy.com. Please give us a thumbs up, make comments, and reach out to me. You can reach me on Twitter at TG Montague, and you can reach me on LinkedIn. I am not hard to find. I also want to highlight that Illinois Solar Energy Association is holding a raffle for a Tesla Model X. That is a luxury pure EV. It's a beautiful electric vehicle. We've been doing this for, I think, 9 years now. So go to illinoissolar.org, click on Win a Tesla. You can buy a ticket for $100, or you can buy 4 tickets for $300. It's a great bargain. And you know that you're supporting a very important solar association here in the Midwest, running since, I think, 1980. So please go to illinoissolar.org and click on Win a Tesla. I want to thank my guest, Melissa Baldwin with Tigercomm. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing your work come to fruition on a much bigger playing field. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure.
I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage.